how to complete the cathedral being built in Florence.
In this great space, we are surrounded by a Gothic architecture ripe for the Renaissance. The flat surfaces of the walls, the crisp, planar detailing of the piers with their sharp angles, not a curve, not a rounded form in sight. It all looks so precise and so completely pre-planned. And yet, if we had stood here half a century after they began to build this building, we would have seen something very different. Behind me there, you would still have seen the medieval houses within the existing foundations. And then, as the piers went up, they were still arguing about how high they should be. When they came to those capitals, they had a competition about their precise form. They had plaster, wooden, stone models, and when that was done, and they were still arguing about the precise dimensions of the building, they went on for 50 years, and not a man in Italy or Europe, let alone in Florence, would have had the foggiest idea of how they could ever put a dome over that great crossing that you see behind me there.
In 1417, a conference of architects was summoned from all over Italy to discuss the problem of how to construct the dome. And eventually, Brunelleschi was entrusted with the commission.
Standing here and looking down into the space, this 150-foot wide octagonal crossing, we can get some idea, at least, of what it was for Brunelleschi to be faced by the greatest architectural and engineering challenge which had confronted any Italian architect since the distant days of antiquity. It was quite impossible to fill this space with a forest of timber, and even if it had been, it would never have supported itself, let alone the weight of the cupola during its construction. So Brunelleschi's primary problem and his first triumph was to devise a form of scaffolding which started not at the ground, but 40 feet above our heads at the top of the drum. And then his second was to build the cupola in such a way that it was self-supporting in the course of its construction. And this is an important part of Brunelleschi's structural solution: herringbone brickwork. Instead of simply laying rows of bricks horizontally, some of them were laid vertically to provide a kind of internal skeleton, locking the horizontal rings of brickwork into place whilst the mortar was setting. Enormous scale involves enormous weight. And Brunelleschi's masterstroke in building his cupola was to devise a double shell, built first of stone and then of brick to lighten it still further. We are standing in one of the passageways between these two shells, and that, of course, solved his whole problem of access for his building materials and, of course, for subsequent maintenance, whilst the great ribs which bind the inner and the outer shells together ensure its strength and structural stability. When we come out into the light, out of the dark passages and tunnels of the dome, we are surrounded by the classic forms of Brunelleschi's lantern. As we look down, we can immediately understand exactly what his great contemporary and fellow architect Alberti meant when he spoke of this magnificent cupola rising above the skies, ample enough to encompass in its shadow all the people of Tuscany.
Not only did Brunelleschi's dome dominate the skyline of Florence, he also systematized the science of perspective, which was to dominate Western pictorial space until the 20th century. In Masaccio's fresco of the Trinity, probably constructed with Brunelleschi's advice on architecture, classical columns and a monumental barrel vault frame the figures of Christ and God the Father. Here is the interaction of painting, architecture, and the mathematical analysis of space that was unique to the Florentine Renaissance. In 1419, Brunelleschi had begun the Hospital of the Innocenti. It was the first orphanage in Europe to be funded by public donations, and the architecture is a delicate blending of the Roman and the Romanesque. It was Brunelleschi's architecture which the painter Fra Angelico depicted in his fresco of the Annunciation, which awaits you at the top of the stairs of the monastery of San Marco. Fra Angelico lived and worked here, decorating the monastery with scenes from the New Testament, scenes striking for their simplicity and serenity. Inside the cells, the world seems to retreat, leaving a single image suspended like a spiritual vision. The buildings and frescoes of San Marco were paid for by one of the wealthiest Florentine bankers, Cosimo de' Medici, whose family symbol adorns the walls. Saint Cosmas was the patron saint of the Medici family, and in Fra Angelico's fresco, he kneels at the foot of the cross. This painting was at the entrance to the personal cell of Cosimo de' Medici, who would retreat from the pressures of business into this setting of intense spiritual devotion. The moment in the story of Christ that these patrician bankers identified with was the adoration of the Magi, the wise and wealthy paying homage to the baby Jesus. And this is the image that Fra Angelico painted inside Cosimo's cell. 30 years later, Botticelli painted the same scene for the same patrons. But now the powerful patrician families have taken over the religious stage. Cosimo the Elder is portrayed kneeling before the Madonna, while his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent swaggers on one side. Every face in this painting is a portrait from the Medici court circle, including Botticelli himself. In another Botticelli portrait, a medallion of Cosimo the Elder is held by a fashionable young man. Botticelli's painting epitomizes the shift in patronage during the second part of the 15th century, away from the world of public competition into the private space of the Florentine palazzo.